The downing of flight MH17 has caused untold amounts of grief for family and friends of those lost. For a look at how they're dealing with the pain, we're joined now by James Halpern in New York. He is a professor of psychology and counseling at the State University of New York. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Wednesday was a day of mourning in the Netherlands. We saw services, flowers, public tributes, people lining the streets. Was this helpful in terms of the grieving process for some of those relatives?
Absolutely. I think that any kind of mourning rituals that survivors are able to participate in, or a show of support from the community, can be very helpful in terms of the processing and the ordering of what is an extremely painful and chaotic experience.
There were delays in collecting the bodies, complaints about how the bodies were treated. Obviously, the victims' relatives have not been able to follow a typical grieving path. How difficult would this be for them?
Clearly, it's going to make it more difficult. Anytime a survivor loses a loved one, anytime we lose a loved one, it's very painful. Certainly when it's human caused, there's likely to be anger and blame, which is going to complicate the grieving process. I think it's might seem strange, but I think some of these survivors might even blame themselves, however irrational that is, because they put their loved ones or allowed their loved ones to travel on a Malaysian airline. And of course, again, irrational, but certainly likely that with such chaotic events, people do tend to blame themselves. All of this complicates the grieving process and makes it much more difficult to heal.
There were so many countries that lost people. How should leaders handle this tragedy, whether they be local leaders, the leaders of the country, the school principals? How can they help in this?
Well, I think our leaders have become consolers in chief and healers in chief, and certainly they need to be present. And they need to show up for the survivors. They need to be there and make personal contact. They're not just, they're there as people, but they also represent us. We who want to be able to provide some kind of support to these families. And they also need to support the communities and countries who have also been traumatized and are in shock and grieving about this event. So leaders who can supply warmth and empathy and compassion and do it genuinely and honestly are going to provide some assistance, not just to the survivors, but to the community and the country as well.
And James, how will the grieving process be complicated by the fact that this is such a public tragedy with a long investigation ahead, with all of it playing out on television and other media?
It is going to make it more complicated for anyone who's lost a loved one, where they're going to have reminders of it in the media, where they become public figures, where they're recognized and it's commented on, where there's a legal proceeding, and with a court events, there's going to be a resurgence of very painful feelings. Going to be difficult for them. I have to say, just to note that this is why family and friends who can provide care and love and support for these folks is what's essential in the grieving process.
I was going to follow up and ask you, what advice would you have for both the family members and people who want to support them?
Well, for family members to be able to tolerate one another's grieving style, there are enormous cultural differences, there are individual differences, there are gender differences, and sometimes with tragedies like these, people have a difficult time appreciating those differences and can make such a tragic situation even worse. So they need to support themselves. Loved ones need to be able to be present and supply all of the ways in which social support can be supplied, and keep their loved ones away from negative support. For those of us who are more distant or detached, events like this can make us feel helpless, so that if we're able to make some kind of contribution to do something in the way of supporting a cause that's meaningful, gives us a sense of agency, and helping others allows us to help ourselves.
All right, James Halpern, thank you so much for your advice and for your insight.